Hello and welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. Today, I'm at historic Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This year, 2025, marks the 160th anniversary of President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, which of course took place here in this theater. So we thought this was the most appropriate place to remember one of the most solemn moments in White House history. Then we'll take you to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where we'll look at some of the unique objects related to President Lincoln from April 14th, 1865, the day he was shot. A mortal wound that would take President Lincoln's life the next morning on April 15, 1865. We are grateful to Ford's Theater Society and the National Park Service for welcoming us today, but more importantly for the care that they put into keeping this sacred place not only a working theater, but as one of the most visited sites in the nation's capital. We're going to meet Paul Tatro, the director of Ford's Theater, who will be our guide today. Paul has led the Ford's Theater Society for more than 20 years. He oversees the theater's administration and is responsible for programming each theatrical season. Most importantly, he is responsible for keeping true to the mission of Ford's Theater, which is to explore the legacy of President Abraham Lincoln and celebrate the American experience through theater and education. Paul, thank you so much for being with us, and I admire and respect so much the work that you do here, and for 20 years you've given the leadership to this important site and the tens of thousands of people that come here all the time. I remember coming here myself as a young boy in 5th grade to Ford's Theater for the first time and the impact that it had on me at that time. And here we are today. And tell us really where we are and what this space is where we're standing today.
We are in, sort of the second balcony here at Ford's Theater. It's a National Historic Site. We work in partnership with the National Park Service. And, as you said, tens of thousands of visitors. We're about 750,000 visitors a year that come to the site. And of course, in the spring, right around the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, we just are, loaded up every day with, school children from around the country.
I recently attended a performance of Sister Act here in the theater. It was extraordinary. But yet, watching the stage and as vibrant and as lively as the actors and actresses are, you always see and feel that box off to the side.
Yeah.
Tell us what that space means to our country's history and to the history of Ford's Theater.
It's really extraordinary, this place. First of all, it sat empty for almost 100 years, from 1865 and then reopened again in 1968. But, you talk about the performances we do here. It is a living, breathing, working theater. And that is actually a tribute to Lincoln's love of the performing arts. People will often say, oh, how come you're doing this play or that play? Well, Lincoln loved the theater. He came to this theater about a dozen times during his presidency that we know of. And it was a place where he got respite. And so for people to be able to come now, whether you come during the day to see a historic site visit or you come to see a performance, I think people are getting to see what Lincoln was able to see in his day and how important this theater was to him.
Historically, why do you think it sat dark for so long, and what was the impetus to recreate it and bring it to the standard that it is today?
Well, the extraordinary thing is, in 1865, Lincoln was the first president that was assassinated. Sort of unheard of, right? And I think because it was at, just coming at the very close of the Civil War and, tensions were so high, I think when he was murdered here, there was threats to burn the theater down. And, the Ford brothers, who had just opened the theater like 2 years earlier than that, it was a brand new theater, and they had just opened it. So they waited for about, a month till after the assassination, thought, okay, let's reopen the theater. The minute it was announced that they were going to reopen the theater, they started protesting in the streets, burned that place down, because they felt like it was a house of the devil, because they lost their beloved father, Abraham. So what happened is they couldn't open it. The War Department shut it down and said, we can't have you reopen this.
Wow.
The federal government purchased the building from the Ford brothers later that year and turned it into an office building. And they used to do sort of Civil War pensions here. And in 1893, they had another tragedy here where they had been doing some construction on the first floor, and one of the floors collapsed, killing 22 federal office workers and injuring hundreds of others. And, people were like, see, that place is haunted. Now, the great thing is, it sat empty, but they never tore it down. It fell into disrepair, but it still stood. And so it was actually under the Eisenhower administration where Congress passed a law to reconstruct the theater and to bring it back to what it was in 1865.
You mentioned that President Lincoln loved the theater. Would this have been a familiar theater to him at the time? Would he have been here for performances?
Yes, we have documented that he came here at least a dozen times. In fact, many people don't know this, but he actually came to this theater and saw John Wilkes Booth perform in a production here. I mean, so, a lot of layers on this story. But, we also believed, back then, Lincoln, he was a very pensive president, a very thoughtful president. He traveled around Washington without a lot of guards and walked around. And we believe that he probably came to the theater at times when the theater wasn't open, sat in the back and maybe watched a rehearsal. So he really was quite fond of the theater. He felt that it gave him a respite from the war and all the killing that was happening during that Civil War time.
This tragic event occurred on Good Friday. The war has ended, so there's probably a celebratory, happy weight has been lifted off of America's shoulders in town, as Mrs. Lincoln invited him or asked him to come to the theater with her that evening. Take us through that sequence of events that brought him to the box behind us.
I love telling this story in this way because I think it turns a terribly horrific tragedy into, I like to take people through where Lincoln was and what he was thinking. So the war had just ended about 10 days before. There was nightly, illuminations and fireworks happening in Washington City then. And that night, Good Friday, he was going with Mary to see a comedy. Laura Keene, who was a fairly famous actress at the time, was doing a benefit that night, Our American Cousin. So they came here. Lincoln was tied up at the White House, and they got distracted a little bit, and the show began. So when Lincoln arrived, the show had already started, but he came up these stairs in the back here. We're going to take a little walk later. And when he arrived, 6'4", and everyone in the theater saw him. The band and the orchestra started playing Hail to the Chief, and everyone in the theater, probably about 1,200 people that night, stood and cheered. So Lincoln, they're cheering, and he walks over to the box, and he tips his hat, and he sits down, and think about it. He was lambasted for 4 years during the war, and here he is tonight, standing ovation, raucous crowd, cheering him. He saved the Union, he brought the country together, and here he is enjoying an evening in the theater.
And he sat down, slipped behind that drape, having been seen by this full house, and was never seen alive again. That was his bow to the country after the war.
And that's what he remembers. He remembers that elation. And I like to take that and not think about sort of the horrors that happened later that evening, about 10:15 p.m.
Tell us what people want to know most about Ford's Theater and this space when they visit, whether they're students or older people or attending a performance. I imagine most people come to a performance here primarily because of the Lincoln connection and to be a part of this space in history.
The interesting thing is that, what people, I think, are most surprised is when we tell them, Lincoln came to Ford's Theater about a dozen times. I think they think, oh, it was a fluke. He just came that one night and it was, a bad timing. No, he came here regularly. He used to go to the opera. He used to go to many of the theaters in Washington. He was a real lover of the arts. And I think people are really intrigued when they hear that. And of course, the other thing that you layer on top of that is that it was John Wilkes Booth and a band of his buddies that were basically creating a conspiracy to take down the federal government. They were going to shoot the vice president. They were going to take out the Secretary of State who lived on Lafayette Square.
Right.
So all of that, people are like, wow, they didn't know all that. And so it's really great to just be able to help educate people and teach them a little bit about what happened here.
We know that this whole plot was planned and considered, and others were involved. We know that Booth stalked Lincoln to some degree. It was said that he attended a speech from the second floor balcony at the White House, and he sat under the north portico and listened to him that week of the assassination. How did Booth know he was coming here that night? Was that a known event? How did people know where the president was going at the time? There was no device to watch.
Exactly.
There was no motorcade trailing
Right.
behind with the camera.
There was no social media.
Yes. How did they know that the president would be here that night?
Well, the great thing, something we don't have anymore today, because we do have social media, they used to have a thing called newspapers. And they had several that came out all day long. So in the morning papers, once they found out that Lincoln was coming to Ford Theater, it was actually advertised in the papers. So John Wilkes Booth is getting his mail here at Ford's Theater and reads this, that President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln are coming to Ford's Theater that night. So he starts to put his plan in motion.
We're going to leave this vantage point here in the balcony and go over toward the box where the president sat on that fateful evening. And I can only anticipate the emotion and feeling that I will feel as we open that door and see that space. And again, thank you so much for sharing this with our audience today.
I'm thrilled to have you here, and I'm thrilled that we can tell this story to your audience.
Great, let's go.
Okay.
So, Paul, we are walking the exact route that President Lincoln would have come into the box that evening, arriving late, coming through the back of the balcony toward the box, which is
thunderous applause. And, President Lincoln, Mary Lincoln, and Clara Harris and Major Rathbone all followed in this way. And, of course, thunderous applause. And he wanted to make his way quickly to the box.
And what do we know about guards and any protection?
He would have traveled with a valet, and that's all he had. And it was just a valet, probably not even armed. And that was all he had with the valet. Sat outside the box. And, this is where Lincoln sat that night. And President Lincoln sat in the rocking chair.
Wow.
Mrs. Lincoln sat in the small wooden chair next to him. And Clara Harris and Major Rathbone would have sat on the sofa.
Wow.
And this box is exactly the way it was that evening in 1865.
So at what point in the play did Booth enter the box?
So this is another one of those extraordinary facts. The fact that John Wilkes Booth was an actor, he knew the play. He knew when the funniest line was going to happen in the third act. He knew when the audience would roar in laughter.
Yes.
And he thought, that's when I can go in and I will disguise the shot from a single shot Derringer. And, people think about gunshots today. Back then, it probably would have sounded like a cap gun going off, and that would have been it.
Now, he had been having a drink next door at the bar. The play is underway. The Lincolns are sitting here enjoying most of the play at that point.
Right.
He comes in through the door where we just entered, steps through.
He waits here. And in this door here, there is a little hole that has been carved out by the management to watch the VIPs and see where they are. Do they need anything? And he watches there. This door is closed. He sees exactly where the president is. He waits for the line in the play. And when he hears that line, he opens this door, puts his Derringer 12 inches from the back of Lincoln's head, and takes a single shot. And that's when pandemonium happens. So Rathbone jumps up. Booth grabs a knife out of his boot and he slashes at Rathbone. Rathbone falls to the floor. Mary is in hysterics, Clara Harris, and Booth jumps to the stage.
Over the rail. And
Over the rail, jumps to
this
the stage.
box is adorned in beautiful flags and bunting. Would it have been the same that night as we see it today?
That's the great thing about the historic site. What people see today when they come here is exactly how the box was that night, April 14th, 1865.
Booth leaps to the stage, and it's not a short fall. It's a distance of how many feet?
It's around 12 feet.
Wow. And breaks his leg and hobbles off where he has a horse waiting
That's
out
correct.
back.
A
and
horse
off
in
he
the back.
goes. What then ensues in this space by the time he's heading off the stage?
So one of the things that Booth did is he jammed a music stand behind this outer door of the box. And so people ran to the box and couldn't get in. So of course there's pandemonium. When people initially thought it was part of the play, and then they eventually, Mrs. Lincoln yelled, "They've shot my husband." There was a young Army medic in the first row of the theater in the orchestra. And folks lifted him up over the balustrade here, and he was the first person to get to Lincoln. He saw the knife. He saw blood all over, which was from Rathbone. And he looked at Rathbone and he said, okay, his wounds were superficial. And he went to Lincoln, who was slumped over. They laid Lincoln on the box, and he started trying to examine him. He saw that Lincoln had a bruise above his eye, black and blue bruise, and he reached behind his head and felt the bullet wound. And he knew then, though he didn't say anything to anyone, he knew the wound was mortal.
So the bullet did not exit the president's head. It stayed in
the skull.
Yeah. And we are going from here over to the National Museum of American History to see the doctor's bloody cuff from when he attempted to assist the president here. From here, he was taken across the street and died the next morning.
In the Petersen House.
Yeah. I can imagine the audience here just milling and scared and frightened, and the commotion that ensued, and as well as those that, as word traveled around Washington and people came to this place. What do we know about those hours overnight and into the next morning?
So, if you figure there was sort of chaos in the box here, they eventually got this door opened, and they had people, allegedly Laura Keene came up and she insisted on holding the president's head. I mean, it was a little bit garish, actually, that probably took place here. And I'm sure that Mary Lincoln was hysterical. It was Good Friday, as you mentioned. And, back then, playhouses were not considered the, nicest of places. They thought, we can't let the president die in a theater. So we've got to get him out. So they started moving him out to the Petersen House across the street, and all of the theater had emptied into the street. So imagine there's 1,200 people in the street. There's probably no one going by. There's no horse carriage or anything. The military has started to come around, and they carry his body.
Just physically carrying.
No stretcher, no nothing. Just men carrying Lincoln's body across the street to the Petersen House. So he probably gets to the Petersen House about 11:15 that evening, and they take him to the back bedroom there. And he then is there throughout the night. The amazing thing is the young Army doctor, Charles Leal, that got to him that night. He stayed with him all night.
Wow.
He held his hand and he said, I'm pretty sure he never gained consciousness, but if he had any feelings, I wanted him to know he wasn't alone.
That is powerful. Did Mrs. Lincoln accompany him across the street?
Mrs. Lincoln accompanied him, and she was so hysterical that when Stanton got there, he said, get that woman out of here. And she went to the front parlor and basically sat there throughout the night. She would come in occasionally to see him and see how he was doing, but she basically was sort of banished by Stanton, and then they sort of kept vigil with him. Dr. Leal said he was a fighter. His pulse would go up, his blood pressure would go up, and then it'd come back down. It'd go up and it'd come, because they took his vitals all night long.
In the 225 years of White House history since John and Abigail Adams moved in, this space, what happened here, is an iconic moment in the whole of White House history, the whole of American history. and the passing of one presidency to another, as we've now experienced through many assassinations, this being the first, and you can feel the emotion that these walls still contain as we're talking about it today. Thank you for sharing this space with us and this really feeling of history that is enveloping us as we talk about it here. We're now going to go down to the museum and see some of the elements
See
of
the
that
artifacts.
evening and artifacts. Thank you for sharing this, and I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation.
Me too.
So, Paul, we've come below the theater into the museum space, which is really remarkable with the artifacts and the story that it tells. This is an amazing painting, an image of that night, telling a specific glimpse into a moment in time.
Yeah. So this painting, sort of recently discovered in the last 15 years or so, was in the Park Service collection. The painter, Karl Bursch, was a German immigrant who was living in a boarding house right a few doors up from the Peterson House. This is the scene that he saw of Lincoln's body being carried. You see the facade of Ford's Theater, you see the gas lights outside, and his body being carried across the street to the Peterson House. And Karl Bursch captured that.
Well, you can feel the emotion of that night. I mentioned it was on the 150th anniversary of Ford's Theater that you had a beautiful evening here. And at the conclusion, we all went out into the street in this moment of silence. And I connect with this moment,
this painting,
from my own memory of that night. It's really incredible to be here. I'm eager to see the Derringer, the actual gun that took the president's life. Shall we go over and see that?
Yes, let's.
So, Paul, a remarkable artifact is here. Tell us about this Derringer.
Well, you know, as I said upstairs, this is really extraordinary. Think about it. This small object changed the entire course of history. Now, there's a great story behind this object. So remember, pandemonium in the box. John Wilkes Booth jumped with the knife. The gun he didn't have. Pandemonium in the box. They have to get Lincoln out. They get Lincoln out, and hours later, Lincoln is across the street at the Peterson House,
and a theater patron is roving around in the box.
This
Patron
picks up the Derringer, and thankfully for all of us and historians and posterity, turned it into the Metropolitan Police Department. And that's why we have it today, 160 years later.
You have an array of artifacts, the gun, the knife, so many elements that we've seen in these spaces. How were these things saved and preserved and kept and found their way here?
Fortunately, the War Department conducted an investigation. And everything that you're seeing here in this museum at Ford's Theater was evidence. It was evidence to convict John Wilkes Booth and the 4 other conspirators that to try to kill Abraham Lincoln. So the War Department kept these for years and years and years. And it was in the 1940s that they finally thought, what do we have these for? They turned them over to the National Park Service. And when this site was recreated in 1968, all of these artifacts came back here.
It's just amazing to stand in such close proximity to the actual weapon that was used that night.
Yeah. It's crazy, actually.
It's crazy. And this represents the size of the
size
pellet.
of the bullet. Yeah, here.
Wow. The knife that you mentioned that he pulled out.
Yes.
Let's see that.
Sure.
We've talked about the knife. Tell us about it.
It's extraordinary, you know, to think that we have the Derringer, the knife that John Wilkes Booth held up that night. And the extraordinary thing is, when we sort of shot high-resolution photographs of these, we could see engraved on the blade is "Home of the Brave, Liberty and Independence." It's just sort of like a crazy juxtaposition of John Wilkes Booth holding up that bloody knife and what it is actually engraved in there.
As we walked from the Derringer around here to the knife, we passed these photographs of these men that were the co-conspirators. They look like modern theatrical images, but these are the actual photographs of the men at that time. It's really remarkable that photography was able to capture them, and we can see in reality who they were.
These photographs were all taken after they were captured, and they were basically, you know, in essence, they would be today's mugshots. They look, of course, like Hollywood shots.
Yes, they do.
Because, you know, photography was so new at that time. But it's great that we have these preserved so that we can, of course, these are recreations, but we have those photographs so we can actually see what these men look like.
We've seen the places and the box, and now we're going to conclude our conversation on the actual stage where the performance was taking place. Let's go upstairs and see that.
Great.
So, Paul, we're walking through the orchestra section, having begun in the balcony. We've been up in the box where the president was that evening. We're now approaching the stage where the performance was taking place that evening. Tell us about the show that evening, and you mentioned that it was a comedy.
Right.
What was the sense of the audience, and were they excited about this show? Had it been good reviews? And
You know, the great thing is, I'm not sure that the show really mattered, but it was Our American Cousin. It was a, you know, typical drawing room comedy of the time. And what made the night special was that Abraham Lincoln was here.
Wow.
And so, in fact, ticket sales that morning were a little sluggish. And once they got out in the papers that the president and Mrs. Lincoln were coming to the theater that night, they sold out.
Wow.
So that's what really made it special.
And how many people does this theater seat? That would have been here that evening.
Today, we see in the theater about 650 people. That night, which they would have had people on 3 levels, we only see it on 2 levels.
I see.
3 levels, allegedly had between 1,200 and 1,500 people here.
That's
that
hard
night.
to believe. They
Now,
would have
the
been
what-
crammed in here.
What you have to recognize is we didn't have fixed seating back then. It would have just been all movable chairs. And, you know, they probably would have had more people than we would put in today. And, you know, I'm sure there wasn't a lot of fire codes back
Yeah, oh,
then.
I'm sure.
So they just had the place stacked.
Now, my focus has always been on the box behind us, but there's an opposite box.
Yes.
What would that have been used for at the time, and there have been guests that evening in that box?
Well, the interesting thing is we believe there were guests there that night, but I don't think it was anyone that was of any significance. You know, it was probably just where overflow that they had. You know, of course, the interesting things about these seats is they're not great for viewing the show. These seats were made for other audience members to see the
them.
VIPs.
So in essence, they're part of the show.
Exactly,
that evening.
exactly.
It strikes me the portrait of George Washington that is front and center on the box. Why that portrait? Why its prominence?
I'm glad you asked that question. It is the number one question that we get
really?
asked. Because people say, why George Washington? I thought Abraham Lincoln got shot there. Remember, as I said, that box is exactly how it looked that evening. So it was the Ford brothers had dressed it up as the president's box. So you would have had the father of the presidency there. And that is why the portrait of George Washington is on the box.
It's amazing to stand here on this stage and visualize the performance taking place that evening, the massive crowd that you've described, the president relaxed, enjoying a show, nearing its end, and then you hear that pop of the gun. And it had to stun this audience. And then you hear Mrs. Lincoln shout. I feel the emotion of it just standing here.
The extraordinary thing, Stuart, is you are not alone. Every actor that performs on this stage, since it reopened in 1968, talks about how they feel when they are on this stage, and they feel the presence of Lincoln. And I think it's what makes seeing a play here, seeing a production, so important, not just for the audience, but also the performers.
Paul, while we were in the box, we talked about the leap that Booth took to this stage.
Yeah.
And when we stand and look at it now, it is quite a drop
Yeah.
from over the rail
Yeah.
down onto the stage. There were actors still on this stage, people gasping and screaming, and he broke his leg.
Yeah.
and stumbled off.
He jumps from the box. He grabs on to the blue flag in the center. That's the Treasury flag. He grabs onto that probably to break his fall a little bit. His spur gets caught up in one of those flags. He hits the stage and he falls to the stage. Remember, he then has the bloody knife in his hand that he's hit Major Rathbone with and stands at the center of the stage and he shouts, "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which of course is the state motto of Virginia, thus always to tyrants. He pushes past the actor on stage and runs out the door to his waiting horse in the back alley.
The actor, the man of the theater, performing this fatal blow to our president and then giving his own monologue
Right.
to those who were present.
Absolutely. He was an actor till the end. It was everything he did was dramatic. Think about it. He had a 6-shooter. He owned a gun that had 6 shots in it. He went in that box with a single shot Derringer that took 15 seconds to load the gunpowder in. 1 shot he went in there with. Why? Because he was an actor till the end.
Why, Paul, are places like this, scenes of American history, important to preserve? And why are these stories important to tell and convey to our next generation of Americans?
Well, number one, and I know that this is so important to the Historical Association, this is our history. You know, Lincoln was shot right at the very end of the Civil War. The Civil War had come to an end, but it was sort of still wrapping up. During the Civil War, 750,000 people were killed. Why this one man's death was so important? Think about it. We still talk about Lincoln today, and both parties take ownership of him. Everyone believes in Lincoln. Everyone looks at presidents today, and they are measured against Lincoln. Lincoln was truly one of the greats. So to understand what happened here, to understand why he was murdered, Lincoln said he was going to give the black man the right to vote. And John Wilkes Booth said that'll be the last speech he ever gives.
We think about the impact and the legacy of this one president. We think about what might not have been, or what would have been differently had this man not been president. A life cut short. He had the balance of his presidency to go. And certainly the aftermath of the Civil War had a different tone and texture than it would have had he lived. But we stand here today in memory of a single president whose presidency saved and preserved a union. And our nation was young at that time. We were not even 100 years old, a fragile nation in the world. And yet here we are today honoring the life and the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. I want to thank you, Paul, for being the caretaker and the steward of that legacy, of this place, which is a temple of White House history and American history. And I'm so pleased to hear that many come here every day seeking to learn about this one life. Thank you for all you do for our country.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you
Paul.
so much.
Thank you. Now that we've explored Ford's Theater and followed in President Lincoln's final footsteps, we have a rare opportunity to show you a few objects. These are not replicas, but the real thing, and each is historically significant from that fateful day, April 14, 1865. We're here at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. You might know this as the home of the Star-Spangled Banner, the actual flag that flew over Fort McHenry and inspired the words of our national anthem, or the Woolworth Lunch Counter that was the site of the 1960 sit-down in Greensboro, North Carolina. And of course, here you can also see a pair of Dorothy's ruby slippers worn in the movie The Wizard of Oz. I'm standing in the American Presidency exhibit. There are so many things to see, including a brass candelabrum that belonged to President George Washington, And in the center of the room is the carriage in which President Ulysses S. Grant rode to his second inauguration. And so here we are with very significant objects to American history and White House history that have been pulled specifically for us to talk about today. And I'm so honored to be able to discuss these with my great friend, Anthea Harding, the Elizabeth Macmillan Director of the National Museum of American History. Thank you so much for welcoming us to the museum today and sharing these special items with us.
You are so welcome, my dear friend and colleague, co-historian, and amazing leader. And so welcome to the Presidency exhibit.
Well, thank you. It is an amazing exhibit, and we've encouraged everyone to come here when they visit Washington. I remember coming to this museum for the first time as a fifth grader and have been many times since, and it's a very special place to come for reasons like this.
Absolutely.
Tell us about
Yeah.
what we have in front of us, a very special, meaningful element of American history.
I too remember coming, I was in seventh grade, but these objects in particular, I think have such resonance. And this one is one of our most cherished. It is a national treasure unto its own. This is the top hat that President Lincoln was wearing on that fateful night when he decided to finally relax a little bit after all the horrors of war. He had said to Mary that he wanted to try and resume a happier life because we have been so despondent and in such despair for so many years.
And so they thought they were going to have a happy evening.
They were going to have a
away.
very happy evening with one of Washington's beautiful actresses and her leading role, Laura, and she'll come into our story later. But he donned this top hat before he left. Now, remember, Lincoln was 6'4" and a bit of change. So we think this hat's about size 7 1/8. It was made for him by Mr. Davis, a very proper haberdasher here in Washington. And it was originally black beaver. And so you can see the silk. You can see the way it was constructed. It's coiled and then covered. It would have been beautiful, dark, kind of satiny black. And then he added the band for mourning after their beloved son Willie had died in 1862. So they went went by carriage from the White House to Ford's Theater.
So this hat would have likely been in the president's lap or by the chair.
They say he put it on
bullet.
the floor because, of course, he couldn't wear it because then truly no one could see
Yes.
over him.
Yes.
And it wasn't very proper
Yes.
for the gentleman to keep his hat
Yes.
on. So
And was saved.
was saved,
And-
kind of all the objects from that night were saved. It was first evidence, and then when it was released, a lot of the objects, because we didn't have a museum or an archive, ended up at the U.S. Patent Office. And this one was transferred to the Smithsonian very early in 1867. So Secretary Henry, who was in Lincoln's administration, he was his science advisor.
And that was the
Yeah.
first secretary of the Smithsonian.
Exactly. So he took the hat and he put it in the basement in a box because he thought, he has this great quote about it can't be seen right now. It's the times are still too turbulent. So this is 1867. It wasn't shown to the public until 1893.
My goodness. So 30 years.
Like
it
a
was held
generation and a
away.
half. And I think it must have still been so raw
Mhm.
and so contested. The memories were so contested.
What was the occasion or what brought this to be shown for the first time?
Henry was in what we know as the Smithsonian Castle, which I call the everything place. It was the house, it was the lab, it was where the bison were, it was the Smithsonian. And after the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, they kind of looked around and they said, what are we going to do with all this? Congress said, well, let's give it to the Smithsonian. So they built a new building, what we know as our Arts and Industries building,
Mhm.
which opened in 1879. It wasn't really a museum, but it was kind of an exhibit hall. And so they finally had a place, I think, to put objects like this.
It's one thing to hear these stories told and to read them in history books. Here we are within
seeing
3
this-
feet of the actual hat. As a historian and the caretaker of this
Yeah.
extraordinary museum, why are objects and artifacts important to keep, to share? How many people a year do you have come to this museum to see these things?
So I'll start with the last question first. So this year we'll probably welcome close to 3 million people The presidency and the first ladies, of course, is such a remarkable
Mm,
pair of exhibitions. And this exhibition is almost 25 years old.
mm.
We would usually have a very dim light on this. For you and your crew, of course, it's a bit brighter. So you can imagine that probably 2 or 3 million people a year see this hat, and then they see the flag, and then they see the incredible material culture around it. I had a board member once say, well, we could 3D print a version of that would look exactly like
Mm,
that, down to the fray
mm.
and down to the contours of how the coating is eroding. And I said, yeah, sure, you could absolutely do that
Mhm.
technologically, but it would never have been on Lincoln's
No.
head. It's that touch with the authentic. It's that this object, along with people who were there, basically bore witness to that moment.
Yes.
It's when we go upstairs to storage, you'll literally get to hold history in your hands. It's visceral, it's meaningful. And when we digitize an object like this, which has been beautifully 3D digitized, then people can see it and learn about it all around the world.
Mm,
But that's beautiful and powerful, and we're
mm.
deeply invested in our digitization efforts.
Mhm.
But when you think about it, it's the knowledge then that that's a facsimile. It may be online or, maybe in a
Of
book,
course.
but it's somehow a copy, a really important one from which we can
Mhm.
learn, but it is not the authentic
So
material.
much of life around us is synthetic. And you
Exactly.
come to this museum and places like it, other Smithsonian galleries and
Yes.
museums and others in
And your
Washington,
own new gallery too. Yeah.
and you
Yes.
see the reality of this was held by Abraham Lincoln. This
Right.
rested on his head
Right.
moments before he was
Right.
struck with an assassin's bullet.
Yeah.
And the reality of history takes on a different dynamic
It does.
dimension in our understanding and feeling.
Yeah. And I think it adds layers to it, right? And when we know the care that's gone in to just keeping
Yes.
these, we were talking earlier, Stuart, that all the little decisions that have to go into an object coming to the Smithsonian.
Mhm. And so easily
Yeah.
someone could have grabbed the hat, taken away, and
Well,
kept it
especially
as a
since he was one of
memento.
either the most popular or
Yes.
demonized men
Yes.
in history at that time. Yeah.
Above this hat is a flag, the
Right.
flag of the country
Mhm.
at the time.
Right.
Tell us about this actual piece of fabric.
So this is one of two known existing flags. You can see every stitch in it
Mhm.
that accompanied Lincoln's funeral train.
Mm.
So when it left the precursor to Union Station on April 21st in 1865. This flag is remarkable for what it speaks to, in that the flag accompanied, of course, the funeral train, but it's also noteworthy. So you can imagine the train. It's had a very long path. It went, up to New York and then down around Chicago and down to Springfield.
Hundreds and
also-
thousands of people
Hundreds
along
of
the way.
thousands of people. And it also carried Willie. Mary Todd Lincoln wanted both her husband and her son to be buried at the same time. So she was traveling with her deceased son and her deceased husband to Springfield. It also telegraphs for us, and I use that word on purpose, that verb on purpose, because before the Civil War, that trip would not have been possible because
Mm.
there weren't the expanse of rail lines.
Mhm.
So remember, the Union invested heavily
Mhm.
in transportation during the war. Some of it very hastily built, others kind of building off of existing rail lines. That kind of journey that the president's body took with his wife and son would not have even been possible without the war that he led. And telegraph, my choice of verb there is that Morse's invention, which we have here, transformed war. So Lincoln would go down to the war room and receive up to the minute
Mhm.
battle updates. So he was very much a commander in chief, and especially after he chose Grant to lead the Union Army.
Yes.
He knew that his choice depended upon his own participation in the war. So
And-
just think of kind of all that had to happen in those
Right.
5 years. Yeah.
And I love the connection to the White House collection, because that telegraph key is in the White House collection.
Yeah.
That Lincoln would have received word of the Lee surrender and
Right.
the end of the war that would have come
Yeah.
through on that telegraph. So
Yeah.
it was the text of the day
It was the text of the
coming
day.
through in as
Absolutely.
real time
Yeah.
as you could get
Yeah.
that this news was breaking. And
Yeah.
so imagine as news went out across the country
I
of
know.
the assassination and the events that followed,
Right.
it was a wave of news and grief that swept
Right.
the nation.
Right.
And as you say, and as you share, the nation got to participate in expressing their grief by following this funeral train.
And as you know, Mary Todd Lincoln's decisions were then echoed, of course, by Jacqueline Kennedy's decision after the assassination of President Kennedy. And Lincoln being the first president to be assassinated, sadly not the last. You think about it, and a still relatively very new nation, 90 years old,
Yes.
trying to understand, like, how do you come together to mourn such a pivotal figure
Yes.
and a controversial figure?
And at a time when the country has been divided
Has
and
been
it's
torn
in critical
apart,
need of a
Right.
unifying figure
which he
and
wanted
time.
so badly to be,
Yes.
right? He wanted the end of his second term to be a president of peace and reconciliation rather than a president of war. Yeah.
And we're here speaking about him, though,
Yes.
reflecting on his presidency
Yes,
at a time in saving the Union and saving our
absolutely.
country. At the
Absolutely.
time that these elements were being saved, the
Mhm.
nation was mourning the president, the assassins were being hunted, captured,
Correct.
and brought to trial. And this was a whole other side of the
Yes.
story, which
Yes.
you do tell here with
We
some other
do.
artifacts. It's really amazing to see the handcuffs and the key to the jail. And these are, again, real elements of history that you can imagine the noise and the sounds and the clanking of the
Correct.
door just by seeing these
Yes,
objects.
and they weren't playing, obviously.
No,
With,
that's a key.
yeah, that's a key, and those are shackles. Wilkes was shot, so when his co-conspirators were discovered and rounded up, it's still very much wartime, and so what I'm about to tell you is kind of haunting, and because it is draconian. But each one of the conspirators had special hoods made for them. They were never allowed to take off their hoods. They were in darkness. They had an opening for them to breathe. And I think the decision, Secretary Bunch and Harry Rubenstein created this exhibition almost 25 years ago when Lonnie was a curator here.
Mhm.
And I haven't asked him, but I'm thinking that they just did not want to put one of the hoods up because they are so, it's a very
just looking at the
traumatic,
pictures, the photographs of them, they're so striking because,
Right.
as you said, draconian.
because they
and
were
you-
at war. His generals lost their commander in chief
Mm.
and persecuted
Mm.
the conspirators and the assassins
Mhm.
who killed
But
him.
amazing to me that elements like the shackles, the key, would also end up. Here
Mhm.
we are,
Mhm.
8 feet from the hat that the
Right.
president wore.
Right. And
And
to put these in conversation together, right?
Yes, yes.
And then the funerary objects and the kind of the reliquary that was built up around Lincoln's
Right.
assassination and Lincoln himself.
Well, you don't have to be a historian to be interested in and inspired by what these galleries tell about our American presidency. And this particular little series of rooms does focus on assassinations and death of the
Right.
president, but the whole of the presidency and that story is told in these galleries. Thank you for sharing this with us. Let's go. I know that we have other things to see.
We're going to take
that
you
are equally
upstairs,
as moving,
yes,
if not
behind the
more.
scenes into our collection storage units. Some people call them the vaults. We do have vaults for the numismatics collection, but we're going to take you up to political history.
Right, let's go. So, Anthea, we've now gone behind the scenes,
You have.
and extraordinary objects of history are in front of us. Tell us where we are and what we have in front of us.
Absolutely. And welcome to the storage rooms, the collection storage rooms of the Division of Political History. We've been collecting American politics really since the Smithsonian began, but especially in earnest throughout the 20th and now into the 21st century. And I'm grateful for my colleagues, Lisa, Kathleen, Grady, and others. I am a truly lucky director. So our Lincoln objects are, you've seen some of them down in the presidency exhibit, and we've pulled some very special ones that help us continue the story. The night that Lincoln went to have a little bit of a break, taken a play at Ford's Theater on that fateful day in April, he had a cup of tea in this teacup, and you recognize of all
Oh,
people,
yes.
you recognize the
Lincoln
Lincoln
China.
China. with its fabulous purple. And of course, our eagle. He had a cup of tea. He put it down on the windowsill and then left for Ford's Theater. A trusted servant of the president's picked up that teacup and then kept it, and then actually gave it to one of Lincoln's attendants, a captain in the Union Army, who then gave it in 1887 to Lincoln's son. It did not then transfer, though. It stayed in the Lincoln family, and it came to the Smithsonian in 1958. I like to think that it was because this museum had been authorized, it was designed, and they were amassing a new collection.
Yes.
That's when we brought in the gunboat Philadelphia, one of the nation's first warships from the Battle of Valcour Island in 1776. So I like to think that this came in that pretty big collecting moment. The museum opened in 1964 as the Museum of History and Technology. So they were building both the technological collections, the prowess of America, but really also, especially the political history. We also pulled for you this remarkable object, which came to us in an envelope. I think many things come to museums in envelope.
Beautiful handwriting.
Absolutely. And it's a hardware store here in Washington up on M Street Northwest. But the cuff, which you can see in this description, was given to me by Laura Keene, the actress. When Lincoln was shot, of course, she was on stage, and the call went out for water. She went to her dressing room and brought back some water and rushed up to the president's box. The stains on the cuff are purportedly Lincoln's blood. So when we were talking before about that kind of
Just
touch
remarkable
with
that would
the
be the blood of
authentic-
Abraham Lincoln right there.
Yes. And then on, literally, I just was able to touch the cup that he had touched before he died. This is, of course, a remarkable object, as are these. Cuffs were incredible like collars because you could wear the same shirt or shirtwaist
Sure.
and change your cuffs because that's what you got soiled, right? Your collars and your cuffs. So recently into the Union Medical Corps was Major Charles Leal, and he was also trying to enjoy a little bit of downtime, as we say, on Good Friday in 1865, and he was in the theater as well. So he was one of the first to attend to President Lincoln, who, of course, who was shot in the head. And we also think that while we appreciate Laura Keene's assistance getting water, perhaps the doctor used it to help try and address his wounds, of course, because Lincoln didn't die till the next morning. So these have also come down to us and are still in remarkable shape, as is this. You can still see the pearl buttons on this. The gentleman's cuff's a little less fancy.
And again, really a saturation of
Yes.
blood stain
Yeah,
here
and then
the
especially
dark.
here.
Just absolutely amazing.
And Lincoln memorabilia, especially around the assassination, was incredibly powerful. And then the collection, of course, continued to really demonstrate how we remember over time, and then the very materiality that we have helps us really continue to feel them.
And the provenance that is recounted by the nephew in
Yes.
this note.
Right.
delivering
you
it
can
to the
imagine there were probably
Smithsonian.
a lot of urban myths and counterfactual narratives around
Right.
many materials associated with Lincoln. And then we do our continue to do our best scholarship around these objects, and we
Sure.
continue to learn more about them.
Sure. Well, I just love the teacup that you can just envision President Lincoln holding
Yes.
it, standing there on
Yes,
the state floor of
sure,
the White
yeah,
House,
yeah.
one last sip of tea,
Right.
sitting it on the windowsill, and leaving the White House for the very last time as President of the United States. And the servant just took it,
Right.
not knowing he was leaving for his death, but
Just
soon
cleaning
would
up.
learn, soon would learn that would be an artifact of history.
Yes.
And it's
yeah,
been
it's
preserved.
remarkable.
Sort of a wonderful part of the tragic story of that evening.
Yes.
And then, of course, the blood just really brings home the magnitude and the reality of the death of a president.
Yes. That's
in
kind of
the
the
hands of
evidence of
these
it. Yes,
two people.
absolutely. Yeah.
Really remarkable.
last
And just an
touches, yeah.
evidence of this collection that you've saved for our country to tell
Yes,
these
well,
stories.
It's
Just
a
a remarkable
humbling honor.
and a remarkable mission that this museum has, the entire Smithsonian has, to open American minds to these young children. I remember reflecting again on my 5th grade visit and
Yes.
how my mind was opened to the objects and places and things of history
Right.
so much
Yes.
more deeply than you can read just in a book. So
Absolutely.
thank you for sharing this with us. This is American history. This is White House history
Absolutely.
right here in front of us.
Right. This is the history of how we remember, right? And how we remember what happened and how we pass that down throughout generations. And it's a true humbling honor to take care and to steward these materials for everyone.
Thank you for what
Yeah.
you and your staff do to do
Thank
that.
you.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode, and watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book, or even the official White House Christmas ornament, you're helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, our White House History Live, in-person and virtual events, the members-only virtual History Happy Hour, and our latest initiative, the People's House, a White House Experience. You know, we're bringing the White House and its storied history to life at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's open to everyone, so plan your visit today and register for free passes at our website, thepeopleshouse.org. And you can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.